So I want to welcome you all to our community conversation about the Sanibel Plan. And I'm really excited about tonight's discussion. This is the first event that we've had here at the beautiful Bailey Homestead since Hurricane Ian hit. And if you look around, you'll see some marks on the wall here. You can see the elevation at which the water got, the surge, and you all experienced the same thing, and we all know that. But as we talk about, we go through this conversation tonight, I think it's really important to reflect on, everything that we've gone through and how much worse it could have been. The Sanibel Plan is, it's a very important document. It's a document that it was the first of its kind in 1976. And it's a comprehensive land use plan that's based on natural systems that puts wildlife and wildlife habitat at the top of the community's hierarchy of values. And as a result, it has helped us conserve more than 70% of the island for conservation. Could you imagine what this island would look like if 70% of it was not in conservation and it were development? I think we'd be looking at a totally different situation. So I'm really excited to have Tom Ankerson with us tonight. And I also want to recognize that Tom is the first fellow for the Pfeifer Fellowship. The Pfeifer Fellowship was put together, was actually conceived by Mary Ellen and Eric Pfeifer to bring in talent from all over the country to study water quality and our natural resources issues here in Southwest Florida. And there was a fellowship that was put together in coordination between Mary Ellen and Eric and Ryan Orger, our past CEO. And we have the good fortune of Tom Ankerson, who is recently retired from the University of Florida, to come here and study the Sanibel Plan. Originally, we were planning on doing another project. And of course, when Hurricane Ian hit on September 28th, we thought it was very fitting to do an evaluation of the Sanibel Plan. And I think tonight you're going to hear a lot about the Sanibel Plan. And really excited to have you all here tonight. And I think what we'll do is, Matt, if you want to go ahead and introduce Tom, we'll jump right into it. And at the end, we will have an opportunity to do some question and answers. And I think anything else you want to do, we'll do it. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'm Matt DePaulis. I'm the Environmental Policy Director here at SCCF, and it's my honor today to introduce Tom Ankerson, Professor Tom Ankerson from University of Florida, recently retired, to come down here and talk to you about the Sanibel Plan. I met Tom a little over a year ago, or 2 years ago, when I was doing a fellowship for him at UF, and he was actually my introduction to Sanibel. Throughout his career as an environmental and land use lawyer, he has traveled the world trying to find unique solutions to problems through the law. And that was the culmination of which for me in my career and his was at the Center for Coastal Solutions, where he was part of a conservation clinic that was bringing together engineering students and law students to tackle some coastal problems. And the main stakeholder for that first semester that we were teaching was SCCF and associated people down here on these islands. So he's the one who first brought me here to give presentations in this exact spot. And I think it just speaks to how invested he is in finding these solutions, especially with how we were able to shift in the wake of Ian. We were doing a mangrove project with some complicated viewshed easement property rights. And while that is super interesting, and I'm sure we'll get to it eventually, I think that having this project now to really capitalize on the moment that we're all in and what we've experienced and how we can benefit from not only learning from the Sanibel Plan, but exporting our teachings to other communities who may be going through similar issues and are looking for solutions. And it's projects like this in conjunction with some of the other work we're doing here on island that's really going to allow us to be a leader in exporting that to the rest of Florida and the world. So without further ado, Tom.
So before I get started with this presentation, I have a very short one. We did have plans to have a student, a PhD student who's part of the Center for Coastal Solutions, come down and talk about his ongoing research here on Sanibel. Just like we shifted this fellowship research from mangrove viewsheds, I think that's not as big a worry for the near term anyway. Everybody can see through their mangroves at this point, but maybe hopefully in the future it'll become an issue. But Adrian also had to shift. He was looking at oyster gardening and had pilot projects out, plots out around the interior canals to look at how the oysters were recruiting and so forth, and of course Hurricane Ian changed all that as well. So he has also developed a project working with SCCF, and that's in its very early stages, but it is looking at the impact or the benefits that mangroves in particular, but natural infrastructure more generally, provide in terms of the storm damage. So the storm damage assessment, the location, the physical location of the mangroves, the surge, the winds, all of that, and trying to tease out the benefits that the natural infrastructure provided to you here. Ian may not have been the best test for that either, because it was over and above what any mangrove could be expected to protect, but there probably will be some lessons. So I'll just work you quickly through this and then move on to the plan itself. And by the way, before I start, there's a bird boxes over here. I bought one. They survived the storm. They look real good. So I'm taking one home, and maybe you will too. It's a great way to support the folks as well. So Adrian's goal here was, as I said, to understand the natural infrastructure of the island and what its role might have been in mitigating harm. This is a very difficult thing to tease out, given all the scientific variables that are involved, but he's going to give it a shot. And he's using pre- and post-storm imagery. This is not going to just do Sanibel Island. He's going to look over on the mainland too, because here the surge came up and over this way. There it came onshore with the mangroves at the forefront. This is Bunch Beach right here. And so you can see possibly some correlations here. And what you see on the left is pre-storm, the middle storm, and then on the right is the damage assessment based upon FEMA's analysis of every building. And it's color-coded from red to blue, indicating the level of damage that occurred. There's some, you can look at it and you can say, well, there's a lot more yellow than red in the main areas, and so maybe that means something. He's going to try and work that out. This is his research question. How does Sanibel's natural infrastructure protect the value of the island's built infrastructure from storm events such as Hurricane Ian? And he's using FEMA data, and he's using storm modeling, obviously, to do this. And the FEMA data is LIDAR-based mangrove cover, and he's trying to tease out the spatial relationships difference, which I think is one of the more tricky things. And there's some AI, artificial intelligence work going into this as well. This is Sanibel, the same sort of pictures. They're not, they don't correlate in the same way, but I would point out that if you look at where the left side, I guess the right side from your perspective, where all the yellow dots are, you can see that those dunes are further in and protecting to some extent those particular structures from the damage that you see in the broader ones based on the red and yellow. And there's a photo of Sanibel, and then, you know, when you don't have natural infrastructure, this is Estero Island, this is Fort Myers Beach, so you can sort of discern some differences there as well. So he'll use the modeling abilities of the Corps of Engineers, some models that they've developed for wave and surge. And they build mangroves that look, you know, that are built out of tin and aluminum, and they run water through them, and they try and analyze the physics and all of that, and he'll be working with that as well. And then with NOAA on the intensity and directionality of the storm. And his next steps are developing this damage data, using different statistical approaches, and then applying the modeling data to that, and perhaps in the fall we'll come down and give a talk and have a more robust set of information for him. So I'm going to leave there. Matt, if you'll help me. See, once a student, always a student. You can ask him to help you out. I've already... Yeah, so the talk Thank you. Now I got two of them. I'll just continue as I was, because I'm not allowed to get in front of the speakers, and I can't walk past these things very easily, so they've constrained the professor. So the title of this talk is No Plan is an Island. Obviously, that's a riff on a poem or a piece of philosophy by John Donne. No Man is an Island. And it's about the past, the present, and the future of this Sanibel Plan, which we hear so much about. I'm going to focus today on the past and run you through this really marvelous history. Remind you exactly why, as James said, it's a revered document here. And of course, everyone, this is Mike Tyson's brilliant quote. You know, he's a philosopher. I knew he was a boxer. I didn't know he was a philosopher, but this gets repeated over and over again in terms of planning. There's some very interesting planning quotes. I'll have another one toward the end here. So what I'll talk about is, to begin with, is the plan and its place in history. And as I said, it's a history that's not just Sanibel's. It's a history of the United States, and it's a history, it's Florida's history as well, and that's what makes it very unique. We'll talk about this history in terms of why the Sanibel Plan happened, which was the causeway and the development that would occur as a result of the causeway, which I've called the Sanibel Rebellion. I haven't seen that term anywhere, but that's basically what it was, led by a number of your forefathers or leaders, including Porter Goss and Eileen Kotz. And then this dream team that this group of people here on Sanibel assembled, which is just absolutely stunningly remarkable in terms of the caliber of people that came here and wrote this plan. These were people who were nationally and internationally renowned and put together the plan that, by and large, remains. So we'll talk about that plan the vision of that plan being fulfilled, and how sort of Ian plays into that, as James suggested. And then I'll conclude with some discussion about what's over the horizon. What did these people, as visionary as they were, what did they not see? And we're seeing some of that even this week in Red Tide and so forth. So we'll talk through that. So the Sanibel Plan, the work on this plan began in 1975. It was completed in 1976. It was created in an era, the mid-1970s, early to mid-1970s, of incredible intellectual ferment in the United States, almost revolutionary fervor over the environmental movement, as we would call it. And its architects, as I mentioned, were among the thought leaders within the context of this intellectual ferment that was our environmental movement. And as a result, the plan became a planning poster child. I did some work with Google and found one dissertation, 2 master's theses, and probably 7 or 8 scholarly articles that in some way or another featured the Sanibel Plan. So I've mentioned the environmental activism. This was 1972 was a sort of a watershed year, both nationally and in Florida. Nationally, you had the Clean Water Act, you had the Clean Air Act, you had the Endangered Species Act, and so forth. And in Florida, at the same time, 1972, you had the beginning of our environmental framework, the Environmental Land and Water Management Act, the act which authorized the developments of regional impact, the State Comprehensive Planning Act, just a whole raft of important state legislation that still is the backbone of our legislative framework to this day, including the Water Resources Act, which Matt is spending a lot of time getting through now. What was also going on in this time was a revolution in planning, and that was based around a landscape architect named Ian McHarg, who was Scottish in origin, but taught out of the University of Pennsylvania and ran a firm. And at the same time, and in similar circles, these folks ran in the same circles. I did learn that much from this this research, a land use lawyer, Fred Bosselman, who literally wrote the book on land use control and the land and so forth. And so these two were sort of coupled with this movement that was going on nationally and in the state over environmental protection, and they were taking it to the area of land use planning and law. And that's where Sanibel came in. So I'll come back to these folks in just a minute, but I'm going to go back to the history of this plan. So it was 1959, and causeway construction was being talked about seriously on Sanibel, and that was obviously going to be very both opening and disruptive to the status quo there. There was just a ferry before. The 1926 hurricane had ended Sanibel's role as an agricultural community because all the salt water that washed over made the soil too salty for salt, and sort of fishing and tourism became the staples, and particularly shelling as time went on. And with that, more Florida was growing too, and you have more people coming for tourist purposes. So there was the desire to build this causeway. It was not uncontroversial, but it went through, and it opened in 1963. Prior to that, and this was news to me too, the city had worked with the legislature, the Florida legislature, for a statute that gave them their own zoning authority, independent zoning authority. I'm assuming this was an independent special district, much like the Captiva Erosion Protection District is one. After the causeway, don't know if this is coincidental, that zoning authority was declared to be illegal by a court. I don't know the basis for it. I haven't seen the order. It may have something to do with only the legislature can authorize zoning enabling authority through municipalities and counties. But either way, Sanibel lost its ability to control its own fate in terms of zoning, and that, of course, is sort of began this rebellion, if you will, over who would control the fate of Sanibel. Would it be Lee County, or would it be the people living on Sanibel? And what you see here, which is clearly contributing to this, is a graphic of the causeway trips. And you can just see how they skyrocket from 1972 forward to 1975, 76. And obviously what that's creating is a lot of development pressure. And in 1968, the county staff had recommended Sanibel for a high-density urban development and a 4-lane expressway running right down the middle of the highway, right down the middle of the island. So this development pressure was building. There were people whose lives were invested in Sanibel the way it was, who wanted to keep it that way, and they began to work at it. They began to get together, and the county was trying to sort of keep up with them and placate them, if you will, and created a committee called the Sanibel-Captiva Planning Committee, kind of an ad hoc committee within the planning department. And that committee was struck down by the courts, or at least the recommendations of that committee. Of the underlying zoning, so you had no plan for Sanibel still. The underlying zoning that the county had for Sanibel is the numbers you've probably all heard many times, which is 30,000 residential units that could hold up to 90,000 people. So you can imagine that now with a community of less than 10,000, what a difference that would make. And you can see that difference on barrier islands up and down the state that didn't do what Sanibel did at the time. They have those 90,000 and they have those 30,000 units, and they go way up into the sky. So on the island, an ad hoc committee was formed, and there were probably people here. Was anybody here was a part of this, this origin story way back then? I could imagine there might be. I've talked to Porter, or at least communicated with Porter Goss a couple different times since then, and in any case, there was an ad hoc committee formed to study home rule, how Sanibel could govern its own affairs. The Captiva was originally discussed, The literature suggests that the concerns of Captiva had to do with losing county support for erosion protection. I don't know if there's a bigger, deeper backstory to that. Porter says that was the primary reason. I have no reason to doubt that, because Captiva has its erosion problems to a greater extent than does Sanibel. In '73, this home rule study group was founded, and a proposed charter was drafted. And the thought leader there was a woman named Eileen Roberts-Lotz, who was referred to at the time or thereafter as the mother of Sanibel. Beautifully drafted charter with some nice language in its initial paragraph about why Sanibel wanted to become its own community. I tried to find more information on her, and it's all out of Miami. She was quite a force in the city of Miami, Dade County. I don't know how, and she ended up over here being the mother of Sanibel, because it seemed like she was also the mother of Miami at some point. but she did, and so she was a significant person working down there as well. They got to the point where they put Sanibel on the ballot as what's called a referendum. First, you had to get the language from the legislature, which they did, the approval of the legislature to incorporate, and then they came in to put it to a referendum, and it passed by about 2/3, is my recollection. There's the language from the original charter, and you can see it has the rationale for creating Sanibel remains the rationale that you have today, which is protecting and putting the natural environment first in terms of its reason for existence. So on November 5th, 1974, the voters approved Florida's newest city, the city of Sanibel. The first mayor was Porter Goss, still around, still very active. I watched the video the other night where the folks were in the city hall, I guess, or at least a auditorium with some really fascinating and, I guess, somewhat harrowing stories of recovery from storms and so forth. They put a building moratorium in while they decided to pursue a plan for the city, a comprehensive plan. Comprehensive plans weren't required at the time. There wasn't a legislative requirement. That came in 1975, which is serendipitous itself. And then, I'm not sure how this happened, but the city, I'm sure it's all about people and connections and so forth, reached out and hired the planning firm of Wallace, McHarg, Roberts, and Todd. That is the firm of Ian McHarg, this Scottish landscape architect who had revolutionized how environmental planning was done. And then the firm recommended that the city retain, and I think that's the way it worked, the legal services of a Chicago-based firm, Ross and Hardy. That firm, one of the associates was Fred Bosselman, who went on to become a law professor at Chicago-Kent, maintain his firm, and start a firm in Florida, and advocate for land use control around the country. So here you had two of the thought leaders in their specific areas working together on this little tiny islands plan way down here in Florida. And at the same time, the Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation had been established several years before, more to support conservation in Ding Darling. But it, on a parallel track, hired an organization out of Washington, D.C. Again, these are people that are moving in the same circles, called the Conservation Foundation, which was a public policy think tank to help to do some of the conservation planning around the landscape, the environmental planning, and the land use law. And so that's your triumvirate, if you will, your dream team that's working on this island's plan in 1975 and 1976. Again, this concept of land use planning and land use law was separate and apart from the environmental movement, but related to that movement, at least in terms of its trajectory. So it was quieter, I guess, and they call it the quiet revolution in land use control for that reason. I think that was a term coined by Bosselman because this was kind of bureaucratic. It wasn't, saving endangered species, stopping the Cuyahoga River from burning, and all the other things that we associate with the early 1970s. But it was, in many ways, the foundation for how you would go to address these other concerns, endangered species, pollution, and so forth. And in Florida, we had the Comprehensive Planning Act passed in 1972, and then in 1975, something called the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act. The quiet revolution in land control referred to increased state authority over local planning. The idea was that local governments plan, and that those plans are to be consistent with bigger plans. At the time, regional plans, that's why we have regional planning councils, and then a state comprehensive plan, and you have this sort of hierarchy that works its way down to the local level, and it all works in harmony to ensure that we have solid, sound planning. That hasn't worked out quite the way it was intended. There's been erosion of those principles right along, but that framework still exists. And Sanibel was among the first cities to actually have a local government comprehensive plan because of that timing. And so Sanibel was trying to limit growth, to limit the development on the island. And this is something that was going on around the country as well. There's stories from California, from Oregon, from New York, where local governments were trying to limit population density with varying degrees of success, of legal success. And Boca Raton became a planning sort of poster child for doing it the wrong way. They said, we're going to have a density cap. We're going to limit the city to 40,000 residential units, and we don't have any science for that. We're just going to do that. And that was thrown out by the court. St. Petersburg had something similar happen. Sanibel took a different track, and it took this long, intricate planning path, putting together the planning, putting together the policy, and putting together the science with its dream team to produce a plan that was never challenged overall. There were small pieces of it that were challenged based upon individual vested rights and so forth, but the plan itself was never actually challenged. Back to our friend Mr. McHarg, it's hard to underestimate, just how significant an individual he was in the field of environmental planning. He's often referred to as the father of modern GIS, of geographic information systems, where you can take computers and you can just create layers and layers of data, and as you look down those layers of data, you'll see places where you can develop, where you should develop, and places where you shouldn't. He was doing it, I don't know how many architects and planners we have that predated the computer here, but with a material called vellum, which is this very thin onion skin, and you would just put one layer of vellum, draw on it, another layer of vellum, draw on it, and then you'd get a result, which is where things overlapped and made sense. So he wrote this book called Design with Nature, which is biblical in that profession. And in the book jacket on the back, it says it may well have been one of the most important books of the century, a turning point in man's view and treatment of his environment. And he was in great demand. He did the plan for the woodlands in Texas, and he did some work in Amelia Island to the north. He did work on Staten Island, and he and his firm worked on Sanibel. And I think some of his associates actually spent a lot more time here than he did. And then we have Fred Bosselman, who I've talked about, the land use lawyer. Land use law was a new field. It wasn't a separate field from environmental law, but it emerged out of that milieu and out of this idea of local control and state oversight of local control and so forth. And so he was involved in 2 reports before the Council on Environmental Quality, which was within the White House, and he was the principal author on both of those. One, this report on land use control around the nation, and the other something called the Model Land Development Code, around which most states placed their built their legislative frameworks. So again, here's somebody who's at the highest levels in DC is operating, and he's working down here on Sanibel as well, alongside Ian McHarg. And a third person was the Conservation Foundation, and the head of that was a gentleman by the name of William Riley, who went on to become EPA administrator in the Nixon administration. He was the head of this conservation policy think tank. They saw Sanibel, and working with Bosselman and McHarg and Porter Goss and Eileen Lotz, they saw this as an opportunity to create a model that could be replicable and used throughout the United States. And so this is explicit. It says the Conservation Foundation undertook its Sanibel work not only to help the citizens of Sanibel protect their natural systems, but also to improve the methodology of conservation. And they authored, again, the McHarg firm, the Bosselman firm, providing the legal support and the defense, and the Conservation Foundation providing the biology with the assistance of the Sanibel-Captiva Conservation Foundation as well, to create something called the Sanibel Report. So this was the foundational document around which the plan was built. It was built in 3 parts. The first part tells this history. The second part is a natural systems assessment, which is the McHargian approach to this overlay zoning and looking at the island in terms of zones and where to put the development, where not to, and so forth. And then the third part is the Sanibel Plan, with the first draft of that plan, or the draft that was produced for the consideration by the new town. And of course, the key to the key to that is this concept that's the central principle, I call it the central organizing principle of governance for the island, for the city, which is ecological zoning. And you still have that in place today. This idea that some zones make more sense than other zones for development, and some zones you can have a little bit more than in other zones, and so forth and so on. And it's very detailed, very well thought out, and they created their zoning framework around the ecological zoning, and that continues to hold true today. And then, once again, this Sanibel report, this plan, was being shown to be, was being discussed as a model throughout the country. And this is from the Island Reporter, which is your newspaper of record. It says, in fact, it is reasonable to assume that what Sanibel does this month will attract attention throughout the country. And those were the hearings on the plan. And here's just 3 more sort of testimonials to this idea that the Sanibel Plan had much more gravitas than just a plan for a little island down in southwest Florida. This is a law professor in land use law out of John Marshall Law School. At the time of its adoption in 1976, it was probably the leading example, at least in the US and probably in the world, of applying scientific methodologies to complex tourism-driven land use problems and producing factual data upon which rationally based land use regulatory standards and decisions. That's it in a nutshell. A quote by Wayne Daltrey, who is well known in these parts. He was the executive director of the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council. He said, Sanibel changed the nature of municipal planning within Florida when it made the island's sensitive ecology the basis of its plan. And then Gil Fennell, who was at University of Houston Law School and also at Florida State University, a recurrent comment in national planning circles is that Sanibel Plan is a planner's dream. As the product of a rare combination of scientific planning and legal talent and maximum citizen participation, it ought to exemplify the highest state of the art in the science of coastal land management. 25 years after the plan, the plan was nominated and voted to be a national planning landmark by the American Planning Association. There's some really interesting other landmarks in there. New York Central Park, there are just a number of them, and it's in there with them. Let me just kind of start wrapping up here. I would argue, I guess, and I think most of you would probably agree, that the Mahardian vision of a nature-first community plan was largely fulfilled on Sanibel. The densities were kept down to the limits that the scientists decided the island could support. That was also included, by the way, hurricane evacuation was a key component of that. So it wasn't totally what the ecology of the island could handle in terms of human footprint, but also how fast humans could get off the island. And you can sort of test this theory with what we call the but-for game, which is but for the Sanibel Plan, what would Ian have done? What would have happened here? Well, we know about that underlying zoning was that the county had. It was 30,000 residential units and 90,000 people trying to get off the island all at the same time. But interestingly, a researcher, because researchers have to find things to research, did this exact thing with Staten Island and looking at McHarg's vision for Staten Island. So he had proposed a land use plan for Staten Island based on his environmental planning framework, but it was not implemented. So a planning professor years hence said, well, what if McHarg's plan had been implemented? In other words, what if 70% or 80% or 60% or whatever it was that was developable on Staten Island had been protected? What would you have had in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy? And what he concluded was that 93% of the structures that were damaged by Hurricane Sandy would not have been damaged had they adhered to McHarg's plan as it was presented to Staten Island, to the state of New York and the city of New York. So that's one way to get at this, what if, as James was suggesting. And then, No Plan is an Island is the title of this talk, so I'm going to take it back there. The plan was a remarkable document in a remarkable period of time. It occurs to me that we're getting close to the 50-year anniversary of that plan, and it might even be time to start thinking about that. 1976 would have been the adoption, so that would be 2026. 1974 was when all the hubris started around the development and so forth, so that might be worth thinking about. And, this was written in 1974. Our view of nature was very different now. Back then, we thought nature was in balance. Now we know that maybe it's more complicated and all of that. And things are cropping up now that they had no idea would be cropping up at the time. And here's some examples of those. Increased storminess. Climate change was not really in the living rooms of people and so forth until the 1990s, when the Rio Convention on Environment and Development sort of produced the climate convention and so forth. Scientists were talking about it even back in the 1970s, but it wasn't something that has the same profile that it does today. But we do know that things are looking stormier all the time. So they didn't really talk about that as a factor. They just talked about the fact that hurricanes come and the islands get hit on a periodic basis. Then there's the water quality issue, which you all are so painfully familiar with here, that's being created by land-based sources of pollution, among other aspects, the harmful algal blooms. And that wasn't something that was talked about in the Sanibel Plan. Water quality wasn't a big feature of it. It was very much focused on the island habitats, and maybe a little bit of the near shore, but not where the water is coming from down the Caloosahatchee from Lake Okeechobee that's occupying all of Matt's time right now. That just wasn't something that was discussed. Sea level rise, I tried to do the search with the old Sanibel Plan, so you had to change it to optical character recognition and so forth. I'm not sure how well it worked, but didn't see those three words together anywhere in the plan, as I didn't see red tide. And then, of course, extreme heat. It's going to be getting hotter and hotter. And then there's this concept that is probably less familiar to you here, but in North Florida, we talk about it a lot. It's called tropicalization. Because it's getting hotter, things are moving. Species are moving north. I was talking to Bob Brooks, and we're getting snook all the time now, and they're not just occasional. They're there, and they survived the last cold snap we had, and so forth. So snook are settling in North Florida. Mangroves have marched their way north, and we have, quote unquote, a mangrove problem because we have these lovely salt marshes that you can look out over, and that's the culture of the people of North Florida, is looking out over vast expanses of salt marshes, and suddenly mangroves are popping up, and they're closing you in. There's kind of a sense of closure as a result of that, but they have all these other benefits. They probably have equal or as much benefits in terms of the biodiversity they support, and they have this storm benefits. But people don't, many people don't like them up there because of the viewshed issue, and just because it's not their culture. So when you build a living shoreline in North Florida, you encounter resistance by people who are afraid that those living shorelines are going to reduce wave energy, which is what they're supposed to do to trap sediment, and recruit mangroves. So that's what happens. The mangrove propagules come in, and they have a place to settle, and you got a mangrove, and the Department of Environmental Protection says you can't cut your mangrove down, and next thing you know, you can't look out your view. You don't have your view. You don't have that salt marsh expanse. Great system, great biological system. What do you do about that? Question for another time. But down here, you have the iguanas. There were no iguanas that I know about. At least they weren't mentioned in the Sanibel Plan in 1974. Now they're overrunning the tropical islands and so forth. That is a phenomenon of tropicalization. They're not the last species that's coming up. And those all have to be things that you think about for the next 50 years. So just to close here, obviously for all of you, there's an urgent need to just get back to the business of being Sanibel. Let Sanibel be Sanibel and get back on your feet and so forth. But it's also probably a good opportunity to start at least the conversation about the future of Sanibel and what it's going to, how you are going to address the issues that were not on the radar of the authors, the architects of that Sanibel Plan. I think that's a worthwhile discussion, and where else but here to have it, because you led the way once, so why not try it again? And I say that even if it sometimes feels like, here's your other planning quote. So I'll leave it at that, and I thank you, James, and thank you, everyone, for listening to me.
Thank you, Tom. Great presentation. I just want to remind everyone, before we jump into the questions, that the Sanibel Plan is only as good as our elected leaders. And so making sure that we continue to elect elected leaders here on Sanibel that support the Sanibel Plan and our conservation ethos here on the island is critical. And I know we have some of our elected officials here tonight. I know we have Mayor Holly Smith in the back there. Holly, you want to stand? We got Councilman Mike Miller over here. Councilman Henshaw, John Henshaw, please stand. Any other council members here? Oh, Councilman Richard Johnson right there, Vice Mayor. Excellent. Did I miss anyone? All right, thank you very much. We're going to jump right into questions. Start with you.
Tom, if any community in Florida today, coastal or non-coastal, incorporated or not yet incorporated, decided that they wanted to do something very similar to what Sanibel did in the 1970s, would they have the authority to do it? And the second question I want to ask is, Do you, from your perspective, see any plumed knight like McHarg or Bosselman or Porter Goss or any of these other people on the horizon who might lead that charge?
Well, those are good questions. Max is a planner, a long-standing planner here in Southwest Florida. So when I saw him take the first question, I go, uh-oh, here he comes. And as to that second question, I mean, I'd have to think about it. I'm sure they're out there, and I'm sure I just have to think about that more as to who out there has that kind of vision, and maybe it was a simpler time too, and maybe it's easier to have that vision than it is now. Maybe it's going to be a chat bot or something, I don't know. As to the first question, I clearly think the authority is there, at least for the time being. It won't be as powerful because the legislature has been relaxing the ability of the state to find plans and consistent and so forth. But you have what they didn't have then, what you have now is the strength of a property rights movement. But again, other comp plans were challenged and defeated, and Sanibel's wasn't. And I think that goes to this basic underpinning of science and planning and policy together. I guess that's the best I can do for an answer. I'm not really sure.
I'm going to give a story about boots on the ground and how vulnerable this island is. Several years ago, one of our neighbors in a small community over a place called Sanibel Harbors, maybe 30 houses at the most, proposed to build a massive dock out over the seagrass. And he was a member of the planning board of the community. And the planning board, and this is a great demonstration of exactly what you were talking about, the potential for erosion of this. He was a member of the planning board, and the planning board approved his proposal. The neighborhood rose up, opposed it, and challenged it and took it to court. And what was interesting was the coalition of the Conservation Foundation and the city of Sanibel joined with us in appealing that proposal, which was clearly against the Sanibel Plan, and we won. And what I'm trying to make the point is, Sanibel is such an attractive environment that it is going to be under constant pressure. And as the comment was made, as long as the leadership and the city council, in fact, joined the neighborhood and the Conservation Foundation to oppose this and defeated it. But the pressures on Sanibel are enormous, and they're going to continue that way. And the moment we relax and don't challenge it, we're in trouble. Not very theoretical, but very practical.
Yeah, thank you. And that reminds me of something I wanted to sort of point out as well, is that's somewhat unique here too, is the close relationship between this sanibel-captiva Conservation Foundation and the city and the community. You don't see that very often, where you have an entity that can provide the specific, explicit science and advocacy that you need, working and partnering with the city and the community. And that all goes back to that first Conservation Foundation report and getting the city and SCCF together. So that is a unique relationship that I think makes this somewhat unique. Max, back to your question, as I've tried to think about some other communities that are similar in that regard. We did a project in Wakulla County, just south of Tallahassee, which was an effort to incorporate Panacea. Does anybody know Panacea? It's what we call a working waterfront, an old fishing community. They were concerned about gentrification marching down from Tallahassee, and we worked through the process of incorporation, I and my students, with Thomas Hawkins, who's replacing me up there at UF. They took it to a referendum. It lost by 7 votes, but it also in the charter had that sort of language that was very specific to protecting the working waterfront for the fishermen and the clammers and the aquaculturists and so forth, and avoiding the sort of what was going on at the time in terms of the conversion of condominiums and so forth. So there may be other opportunities out there where that happens too. Oh, and Ralph, who's the local government attorney for Yankeetown, you tell him, Ralph. So this is Ralph Brooks. I've known him since I was in law school. And
So Tom Ankerson and his students from the Conservation Law Clinic at University of Florida Law School helped us out at the town of Yankeetown. There was a proposal to double the population of Yankeetown and put in dry dock marinas and probably double the population of boats that would be there. They rewrote their comprehensive plan, and they picked up many of the ideas from the Sanibel Plan and implemented that. And they were challenged, and they upheld it in court. And it has a vast area of this salt marsh that Tom was talking about. And then when the legislature allowed adaptation action planning, we reached out to University of Florida again, and once again they helped us prepare and adopt and implement a new chapter in our comprehensive plan for adaptation to sea level rise. And part of that was developing both a a business plan and a science plan. And they were intricately entwined. The science plan was to bring scientists from around the world to study sea level rise in Yankeetown. And that was also part of our business plan, because we'd have to house these scientists and we'd have to feed the scientists. And it's a little bit less developed even than Sanibel. But that was adopted, and that's in place, and now that's a model for other cities and counties that are doing adaptation action planning for coastal sea level rise.
And Ralph was our lawyer and defended the plan language that we wrote. So yeah, thanks for reminding me of that one as well, Ralph. And we used ecological zoning principles in that as well. So yeah, there's some other examples out there. Just have to keep thinking about them.
What do you see as the direction of home rule in Tallahassee and its impact on the Sanibel Plan?
Well, that's a really good question, and the direction home rule has been away from it for a couple decades now. There's a legal concept called preemption, and basically the shoe is on the other foot now. At the time that the Sanibel Plan was being developed and all these local land use plans, this quiet revolution was happening where the state would exert oversight over local government planning. At the time, Tallahassee was controlled by Democrats, and the Republicans were claiming that this was preemption, that they were taking away the rights of, I'm using these terms broadly, but these were the coalitions, were taking away the rights of local governments and private property rights and so forth. Now, the shoe is on the other foot, and it's the communities, the democratic communities, that are trying to retain their home rule, to retain the authority to do things, and it's the big brother in Tallahassee, which is trying to restrict those, any types of innovations. And so it's kind of interesting to see. It's the political flip-flop, if you will, is quite obvious and evident. And so as an answer to your question, there's been a constant erosion in local government home rule through this doctrine, this ability of the state to preempt local governments, and that could easily happen in Sanibel and elsewhere too, if certain interests are affected.
Tom, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question real quick. Now that we, as James mentioned, we have what I think is a pretty intelligent city council. So the leadership, present company excluded. But since we have, I think we're fortunate to have this kind of arrangement. We also are fortunate to have experience. And I think it is an example of what can happen to us with Ian. And we have an opportunity now to realize what that true impact is and what we should do about it for the future, because we're going to see more frequent storms. For the adaptation of sea level rise, is there an opportunity for us to revisit the Sanibel Plan, since we're 50 years on? As you mentioned, it didn't cover sea level rise. It didn't cover a number of things that we're confronted with today. Is there an opportunity for us to revisit, since we have a very intelligent city council and residents, to revisit the Sanibel Plan, upgrade it to deal with sea level rise, adaptation, as well as more frequent storms? Do you think that's an opportunity for us?
I do, as long as you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. So there's some things in the plan that are, not in the plan, but in the city charter that are interesting. There are sections of the charter which require what we call supermajorities for certain things to occur, like changing the ecological zoning, and some of them even require a referendum. And these were put in place, I think, when there were threats to the plan in the past. I haven't sort of gotten into the details of that evolution.